we can probably break after this for a few minutes before lunch, is talk about an example that I have that will illustrate and bring a lot of these ideas into, basically help to illustrate a lot of these principles with a concrete example. And so I don't like to use software or hardware because there's a diverse audience. And so I'm just going to use the process of how I actually wrote the book that I mentioned before. And so this very much follows the same process over here. I'll kind of outline through that. And so even though many of you may not have written a book before, you can still appreciate the steps of writing a book. It's not an easy undertaking. It's something that can take months and sometimes even years for some people to actually write a book, to find the time to do it. So it's a lot of work, and it's almost like building a product, as we'll see. And I apply the same process to do that. So I'll kind of recount that story. So going back 2 years, I mentioned how I ran into the works of Steve Blank and Eric Ries, and I decided I was going to apply those principles to my next product because I've been building products all these different ways. These principles resonated with me at a theoretical level, and I wanted to take them down to practice. And so for a few months, I just tried to literally apply what was in the 4 Steps to Epiphany and what Eric was saying. And I quickly realized that there were a lot of gaps. There were a lot of things that they were talking about that were hard to apply. So in the case of Steve Blank's book, most of it was written with an enterprise software context. So a lot of the techniques that are in the middle of the book were completely useless. I mean, they're not completely useless, but they were not very applicable to what I was doing. So I had more questions about how do I really do these kinds of things? How do I really get these interviews? Do I pay them? Do I not pay them? What are some of the things that kind of go with that? So I had all these questions there. Looking at Eric Ries, he was writing a lot about the lean startup, but he was writing more retrospectively, looking at a company which was no longer, IMV was no longer a startup. While it started out as a 3-4 person kind of endeavor, it turned out to be, at that time, was a 50-person company making $40-50 million in revenue a year. And so when you looked at them, they were really a lean startup machine. They were pushing software releases 50 times a day. They had these very complicated systems in place, metrics, all these kinds of things. And so it was very daunting and very scary to actually look at that and say, do I start building those systems now? Like, what do I really do? And so I decided that rather than doing nothing, I was going to start this blog, and I was just going to outline my own experiences of applying this process. So every week, I took these ideas and I started building. I did interviews and shared that learning and just started the process there. And I actually probably was fortunate because it was good timing, because at that time, Eric Ries and Steve Blank were also evangelizing a lot of these concepts early on. And the question they would often get is, well, we know it worked for you, but who else is doing this? Who else is interested in lean startups? And can you show any other person applying this? And so they would often point to my blog and a handful of other blogs. So that helped to drive some early traffic, early traction. And I was able to build a readership pretty fast, even just with that weekly learning. And along the way, I started to get requests from a handful of people to write a book. And at first, I kind of laughed that off and said, I'm flattered, but I'm too busy running my own startup. A book is something you do. You basically go into the mountains for a year and you write this book. I don't have time for that, so I'm not writing any book. And so I turned them away. But after about the 12th request, I decided to take it seriously and at least see if there was something here. And that is that first stage of understanding the problem. So I set up phone calls with all the people who had requested that I write a book, and I actually tried to talk them out of it and said, there's this blog, but more importantly, there's all this content. There's all this online content. Eric has content. Steve Blank has a book. Other people are writing books. What is my book really going to add to that conversation, and why should I write it? And so they helped me articulate what became the value proposition eventually. And that was, again, that whole notion of the practice trumps theory concept, is that, like me, many of them were earlier stage startups, or even just companies that were interested in lean startups, but were running into the same obstacles of how do we take a lot of these theoretical principles or ideas and really distill them down into actionable practices and techniques that actually can work and can raise their chances of working. And so they were looking at my blog as a way that was kind of very transparently outlining those things, and they felt, and of course everyone downplays the complexity of building products. So many of them said if all you did was just take your blog posts, did a little bit of cut and paste job and slap them into a book, you would have a book and they would pay for it. And so I was like, okay, that's probably not achievable, but there's some value in that because I have been writing all this stuff, so it'll be easier to write this book. So I said, fine. So at that point, I had 12 people So that's the qualitative validation. I had 12 people who said they were interested in writing this book, but I didn't go off and try to write the book. The next thing I had to do was build my demo, or that proxy of a solution. So I built a teaser page, which at the time looked something like this. And it's dark, you may not be able to see it clearly. But it was not very pretty. It didn't even have a book cover, because I knew that the book cover was not going to sell a book. You know, it's not the book cover that sells the book, it's what's in it. So I just picked a stock graphic. At the time, I didn't have an old enough version of this, but the title that I had picked was Getting Lean versus Running Lean. And a lot of people felt that was too passive. They felt that it needed to be more active, and so I turned it to Running Lean eventually. But that's an example of how I took the idea of the book. I created this landing page and called those 12 people up and said, if I wrote this book, would you buy it? Now, I was more interested, above anything up here, I was more interested in the table of contents, because that was going to be what was inside the book. And so I showed them this table of contents, and that was a great way to get the initial feedback on what should be in this book, and it helped me refine the table of contents. People helped me, people helped me organize this in a much more coherent manner. And then I didn't have price on here because this was going to be a business book price between $20 to $30. I just tested that on the phone and said, if I build this product, would you pay $20 to $30? And all 12 of them said yes. If you wrote this book with this table of contents, I would buy this book. So at this point, I had that qualitative validation where I had 12 people that were willing to buy my book, but it wasn't yet a problem worth solving. Because even if I wrote this book for 12 people at $20, that was like a couple $100. It was not going to cover my costs for writing this book. And so what I did then was basically put up this teaser page, or added this. I put a coming this summer. This was February of 2009, and I was bold enough to say coming this summer, and then I put in an email page for people to kind of register their interest. And I left this up. I did a little bit of promotion. I blogged about it. I tweeted it, and folks like Eric and Steve helped to promote the fact that I was thinking of writing a book. So that also drove some traffic. But I started to collect email addresses, and then I just did nothing. I kind of left this teaser page up, and I went back to running my product. And about early summer, I had 1,000 email addresses on this teaser page, and that's when it became a problem worth solving for me. That's when it became interesting, because at those numbers, I did the math, and I did think a lot of it could be done with cut and paste. With that math, I felt like if I actually wrote this book, I would break even, and I would be producing something of value. So why not? And I'd probably get more people signed up over time. So why not? Let's take this seriously. So I started writing the book, and it was not as easy as I thought. It was not really a cut and paste job. Even the first chapter was hard to write. And so I then built the MVP for the book. So rather than going and trying to really write a book, I actually announced a free workshop here in Austin. And actually in the original TechCrunch, those are the guys who hosted it. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you first put that page up, how sure were you that you were going to write a book?
I would say I was 50-50. I mean, it was an idea I was entertaining, right? And that's something that I stress a lot about in the whole process, is that I'm all about experimenting, even with ideas. So as an entrepreneur, and I'm sure many of you are the same in the room, is we constantly get bombarded with ideas while you're in the shower, while you're driving. And for me, what I'm really in search of is, how do I find ideas worth pursuing? How do I find problems worth solving? And this is a real example of how that really happened, where it was so the first case was a situation of me not even looking to do something, but in the lean world, we call that customer pull, where a few people said, you should go do this thing because you're qualified to do it. And then you kind of explore and really make sure it's an idea worth pursuing. And that would be something that would be worth your time before you kind of get around to do it. So I would be happy to have taken that teaser page down if I hadn't gotten enough folks on there and said, it was just not going to be worth the effort, or left the teaser page up long enough till where I'd got enough people on there and maybe eventually got tired and pulled it down. But I would say with the free workshop, what I did there was, it was very much like the workshop that I'm showing you now, but not nearly as fancy on the graphics. It was really death by PowerPoint, or death by bullet points. So I took the table of contents that I had, and for every one of the major chapters, just created a page. And I even have those original versions. They were black and orange. They were really ugly to look at. People would get eye aches looking at them. But the idea there was to just, again, test the content out. So I put these slides up. I announced a free workshop. I didn't really have any narrative of what I was going to talk about, but I just announced that to the Lean Startup group here, and a number of people jumped at it. So 30 people jumped at it, and that's a good technique to also use with your products. Is if you can give away your product for free, it's very hard to really charge for them. And so it's a good way to test if you're actually producing something of value. So I had 30 people interested in that, and there were a number of folks from TechCrunch. There were even people like Jason Cohen was one of them who was interested to come in. And so I was able to hand select the initial 10 because I wanted to start with just 10 people. One, because we had a small room, but two, because we talk about another principle in lean startups is one of iterating in small batches. So if I had taken 30 people and those are all the people I was able to attract, and I did one workshop and it failed miserably, then I would have no other way to test this idea after those initial 30. So, but by taking them in batches of 10, I gave myself the opportunity to run at least 3 workshops and test the concept and iterate on the slides if I needed to. And so we did this workshop, and at the end of the workshop, the feedback I got is that it was really valuable, it was super helpful, and many of them